And frankly, I totally agree. Treating our soldiers like athletes is the way to go. Little PMCS from the soldier perspective is what we need, and that's a great program. Dovetailing on that at the organizational level, the next panel is going to discuss the medical generating force and how it enables force protection. A lot of changes going on. I don't have to tell this group, especially the medical professionals here, the changes going on inside the medical community from an organizational perspective. But this panel is going to discuss what does all that mean for how we generate a force that can support multi-domain operations from a medical perspective going forward. And to lead the discussion, a good friend of ours, Mr. Stephen Rodriguez, the managing partner of One Defense, will carry on from here and introduce our panel. Thanks, Stephen.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today. If I'm honest, I'm a bit struggling to remember what day it is. I was out at the Reagan National Defense Forum all weekend in LA, and then came back, got on a 6:30 train to New York, and due to the modern blessing known as Amtrak, got in at 3:30 a.m. this morning. So I think it's 2022. I think to set the context for our third panel, the medical generating force, I think it's important to relay a couple takeaways that I heard, at least, with the Reagan National Defense Forum. And that is, for the last 20 years, frankly, my entire professional career, I started in the Pentagon right before 9/11. We've all been about sustainment in distant, primarily desert theaters and low intensity conflict. Sorry, low intensity compared to what we're facing now with China and Russia now. And yet, what's interesting is over the last couple of years at RNDF, what I've noticed, and this was obvious this weekend, is that we are, as a national security establishment, fully gearing up for major combat operations against two competitors. Whether or not we want to fight two wars or not, I think they are interested in fighting wars with us. Now, whether or not that happens is to be seen, but I thought it was very interesting and I think helpful context for a panel such as the medical generating force, when whether or not we still believe in a two, my terminology is dated, but a two MCO, remember that term? A two MCO CONOP. I think Russia and China are interested in putting us to the test. And I think the focus of this panel, which is primarily on readiness and sustainment, is very, very timely when viewed through that lens. So what is a medical generating force? A medical generating force, defined by the Army, refers to the Army's institutional organizations whose primary mission is to generate, prepare, and sustain operating forces of the Army through execution of Title X responsibilities and tasks to include those which support medical readiness and medical modernization. So here to discuss these topics today include Mr. Chris Rheney, Deputy Chief of Staff for G8, G9 at MedCom, right? Brigadier General Wendy Harter, Deputy Chief of Staff for G357 at MedCom. And then, of course, Ms. Dawn Rosarius, Principal Assistant for Acquisition at MRDC. I'm sure you can read their bios if you have not already read them, and I'll spare them and us the lengthy reading of them so we can get down to the topics at hand. What we'll do is as you've probably seen with the other panels, we'll give the panelists a chance to make some remarks. I'll ask a couple of questions, and hopefully, I know you guys came here to be talked at, but also hopefully to talk back to us as well. This should be old hat for you, but you have note cards. You should at least. So please feel free to submit those in advance and early and often throughout this panel discussion. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Rheney for his opening comments, please.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks to the AUSA leadership and to Lieutenant General Dingle for inviting me to come be a part of this panel. As Lieutenant General Dingle's resourcer and in the dual hat on the OTSG staff, but also the MedCom staff as the G8-9, MHS transition a lot of it has been focused on resources and roles and responsibilities. One of the jobs that I have within the Pentagon is kind of doing the Pentagon tour up at OSD. So I spent a lot of time talking to OSD CAPE, OSD Comptroller, OSD PNR, Manpower, all these folks. And there's tremendous pressure on the Defense Health Program and medical resources as a whole. And so understandably, there's a lot of pressure with the NDAAs and the transitions that we're going to talk about here of a huge chunk of our generating force over to the Defense Health Agency. And so part of my job is helping OSD understand, because a lot of the questions I get from them is, well, why do you have this medical generating force footprint? And what does it do? How does it help the operating force? And so it's essential for us as an Army to be able to tell that story and explain how we help with developing the .NLPF for MDO and medical and all the other things that we do. So what I want to do here as we start out is just provide kind of a framework for this discussion. And Stephen outlined a part of it, and I'll just insert some medical into that with the definition and all. But I wanted to, in my opening comments, just to define the medical generating force, to describe its purpose, and then also to help paint a picture on how the medical generating force enables health force protection and readiness for the Army. So as Stephen already kind of alluded to, and I'm just going to add in, I'm referencing Army Doctrine Publication 1, which is the new way that we're looking at a lot of these doctrinal documents. Historically, we had FM 1-01 that talked a lot about force generation and generating forces, and I'll reference that as well because I think there's some really good language in that that's still applicable for today. But the medical generating force is a part of the Army's institutional forces and ensures medical readiness of all Army forces. It consists of those Army organizations whose primary mission is to generate, prepare, sustain operating forces of the Army through execution of Title X responsibilities and tasks for medical readiness and modernization. So that's the quote out of ADP 1. The purpose is found in AR 525-29, force generation and sustainable readiness. So really, this is where the medical community and the generating force plays a huge role in that sustainable readiness process that the Army is undertaking. So the medical generating force is essential to achievement of the Army's overall force generation sustainable readiness process. And according to AR 525-29, the Army generates the total force through key processes to direct, develop, preserve, and provide Army forces to meet known, emergent, and contingency requirements for the combatant commander. So the Surgeon General, in coordination with Headquarters DA, and now I'll add in the Defense Health Agency, and I think we're going to talk some more about that in some of the questions. The ACOMs and the ASCCs is the one who plans, develops, and coordinates medical force generation priorities for the Army, for the Guard, and for the Reserve Forces. So between definition and purpose, one of the things that I think, we easily defined the generating force by historically was really the MedCom. Most of the MedCom incorporated the medical generating force. But how has that changed? So there's 5 primary organizations today that drive medical force generation. We have the Army Medical Logistics Command under AMC now that provides medical material maintenance sustainment. We have the Medical Research and Development Command under Army Futures Command, which is the material capability developer along with research and development. We have the Medical Center of Excellence under TRADOC, which does the training and the doctrine. We have the Historical MedCom, which provides health service support and health force protection. And now, as we reorganize under medical readiness commands and military units that will be our organizations in our MTFs. So we're still going to have the military in the MTFs. And those are military units that will enable health force protection and readiness. And then finally, and most importantly, the Office of the Surgeon General. The role there is to integrate through one of those little Christmas gifts General Dingell talked to you about, the Army Medicine Campaign Plan. So that's how we are now going to synthesize, synchronize, and integrate all those efforts across the Army to ensure we have the force generation platforms. 2 of those key, so I won't read them all off to you. I know you've got them out there to look at, but 2 of the key ones that we're going to talk about today is supporting the modernization effort and then building readiness. They're all important, but those are two of the key drivers in force generation and the role there. So I kind of talked through those 5 primary organizations. If you think about the battlefield, kind of how they're laid out, and back to kind of the headquarters and the Office of Surgeon General. And one of the real important takeaways, I think, looking back at FM 1-01, one of the quotes I took from there is that, generating forces are functionally discrete, but organizationally integrated with operational forces. And that also they possess operational useful capabilities to develop and sustain potent, adaptable land power capabilities. And so this is the key role as you think about, and we're going to talk about responses to COVID and other things. This is what the generating force does for us. Not only the trained man equip, but also providing those adaptable capabilities that will enable our operational missions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. General Harter, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you, Steve, and thank you, gentlemen, and AOSA for having us here today. So just to spin off of what Mr. Rheney just described a little bit. So if you look at the last 20 years of crisis, conflict, and competition, where you had medical forces engaged in everything from building partnership capacity to humanitarian assistance, disaster response, and combat operations, the operational force and the generating force are really inextricably linked. And everything from providing our PROFIS, professional filler system of the past, now the MTO assigned personnel, and that's the trained and ready clinical arm that embeds with the operational force and hits the battlefield, to things that happened in Iraq, where we started to split base or combat support hospitals, and we had to establish role 3s at multiple locations. Well, the generating force is what provided that capability onto the battlefield to enable that to happen. It's everything from where we had to provide theater pharmacists, infectious disease docs, to look at where wounds, because of the blast injuries and the bacteria that came out of the soil, were creating post-operative infections that we needed to learn how to deal with on the battlefield. It was establishing a joint theater trauma system by sending clinicians downrange to collect data to feed to the Institute of Surgical Research at Brooke Army Medical Center, to feed data to the Medical Center of Excellence, to change our programs of instruction, to change our clinical protocol guidelines, to ensure we had those high survivability rates that we enjoyed, and codifying all that and continuing as a learning organization, inculcating that into our system. It's tying the point of injury across the continuum of care to the role 4 reception centers, which are Lonsdale Regional Medical Center, Brooke Army Medical Center, for example, the only level 1 trauma center in the Department of Defense that sees up to 7,000 trauma cases a year in San Antonio, the only place where we're really getting the trauma reps and sets outside of our civilian partnerships that General Dingell described, to the scope and scale to drive a ready medical force. And another example of where the generating force directly ties to the battlefield is Brooke Army Medical Center. About 2 years ago, I think this mission occurred. Our extracorporeal membrane oxygenation team was activated to go down into Afghanistan to pick up a severely wounded ranger who was in Bagram, and flew him all the way back. This was a joint team with Air Force components as well, but flew him all the way back 17 hours straight, refueling in flight, right to San Antonio. We popped him right into the BAMC operating room and proceeded to give him everything that institution could to save his life. By the way, he's now out and about with his family today, triple amputee, but out and about, thanks to what Army medicine does, both on the operational side and the generating force side, because those surgeons that were in Bagram that operated on him were trained at Brooke Army Medical Center. The Ranger medics that were out employed far forward, it's because of their programs. And in fact, they transfused blood there at the point of injury and brought that soldier back to us alive. And so it's also, today with our medical response teams and the urban augmentation medical task forces, where the generating force has provided the agility for the Department of the Army. It's not just FORCECOM, but these are MedCom assets going out and about, tailored to work with the FEMA and the HHS response under Army North. It's the monoclonal antibody teams that we developed for employment as well. And then most recently, it was the response in Afghanistan, in Kabul, where 82nd ripped out overnight. We sent a forward resuscitative surgical detachment with them. Again, those providers came out of the generating force, and they were able to do what they had to do in Bagram, but simultaneously, the medical command was deploying forces to Landstuhl to plus them up to receive not just combat casualties, but our Afghan travelers that were coming at us through the evacuation efforts, where suddenly there's a demand for obstetricians, for OB nurses, for pediatricians, for pediatrics, and things, specialty skills that are really only resident in the generating force, but in this mission set applicable not just for LRMC and Yukon, but also on the 8 installations that they landed here under Operation Allied Welcome. And to today, we're providing that and public health assets as well to deal with this population at risk. And so that, that's again, just examples of where, as we move into the future, the generating force is certainly there to provide that agility and to provide the readiness that our Army needs as we move into the future.
Great. Thank you very much, Ms. Rosarius.
Good morning, and thank you, AUSA, General Dingle, and General McQueen, who has really told you a lot about MRDC. So I'm going to dive a little deeper and talk about how we support from the generating force. So specifically in medical research, development, and acquisition. At MRDC, we are in the business of preventing injury and saving lives. To achieve this in an era defined by increasing threats and complex landscapes, we do that research, we look at technology, and most importantly, we have key partnerships to support our warfighters. So as you've heard and the men and women in uniform face unique and evolving threats each day, and it's just going to get worse, unfortunately. Threats that need to be countered with innovative solutions, and the MRDC is really leading the way in providing those innovative solutions. The Army modernization strategy is to make warfighters and units more lethal to win our nation's wars, but we also need to then bring them home safely. So we're using that research, development, and acquisition to support this strategy. And we are continuing our current efforts, protecting the homeland, as you know, over the last 2 years, and also responding to COVID-19 pandemic. Some would say this is a tall order, but we are prepared for that challenge and we continue to move forward. We know the future battlefield will not always be optimal or even desirable for combat casualty care, and we've heard a lot about that already. So we really have to focus on technologies to reduce that medic burden and support patient care. But also, and you just heard this in the H2F update, we have to provide solutions that enhance human performance. So our warfighters are armed with prescriptive measures to keep them operating at full potential. And you've heard a lot about H2F earlier. Our labs were really involved in providing that scientific data to help in that area. And our teams are also going to, as the PM, be the PM for the medical equipment sets we're going to put in the hands of our operational force. So we're leveraging these technologies and a number of diverse scientific areas as well: robotics, cognitive psychology, biomonitors and sensors, additional medical diagnosis and treatment, and artificial intelligence. So how do we pull all this together? So we do this, as I mentioned, through our innovative team of researchers and project managers, and by partnering with industry and academia, and by being part of things like this today to help us pull the right teams together to modernize solutions, to maximize that human potential and save those lives. We have a number of success stories, and I just want to share a few that include analyzers to detect traumatic brain injury, wearable medical devices to help with diagnosis, apps to help monitor our soldier health, diagnosis and treatments for infectious diseases like COVID, and systems to enable our medics to wirelessly connect with that patient data they're receiving from the warfighter back to the medical treatment facility. All of this will help us sustain health, allow faster triage, and ultimately return our troops back to duty quicker. So we take every measure necessary to ensure that we are getting the right products into the hands of our warfighters and medics when they're needed. Because of this, MRDC has increased the number of warfighter touchpoints, as you heard from General McQueen, to allow for that frequent user feedback. We hadn't always done that in the past. We thought, we know everything. We're just going to give you what we think is best. Wrong. So we have to have the users involved earlier and more often. And we've adopted some unique set of acquisition capabilities to accelerate solutions to the warfighter faster. One of those is a consortium other transaction agreement, or an OTA. And so we use this to allow for more conversations between us and the performer or the contractor earlier in the process as compared to other traditional contract vehicles. And it also creates a unique environment for our non-traditional contracting partners to get together earlier and show those opportunities. Another thing we're often asked is, hey, you're an acquisition person. Why can't you get everything out there quicker and cheaper? And we say, sure. And we have to provide the right solution that's going to meet the need at the same time. So when the pandemic began, that was something we asked frequently and often. General Dingle asked us that often. And so we looked at how we could do that. And agility was crucial as we worked to prevent, detect, and prevent COVID. Our command's ability to pivot for the current threat and rapidly respond was instrumental in supporting the whole government effort. And I believe we're going to talk about that more here shortly. So as MRDC continues to focus on our research, development, and acquisition, we are aligning those goals with the future force. We are doing that through partnerships and increasing our ability across the whole generating force to continue to get those right products and solutions in the hands of our warfighters, and especially our medics. So, and as I mentioned, meetings like this really help us highlight that and pull the right people together to make that happen. So again, thank you for this opportunity.
Super. Thank you very much. I wanted to talk about a couple of pressing topics in the form of questions back to you three. Let's start out with the pandemic, of which we have a daily and constant reminder, whether we want to or not, kind of like the Russian and the Chinese, now I think about it. Uh, so here's a question, and I'll direct this towards Mr. Rheney, but if any of you guys would like to do a two-finger, feel free to tag on. Okay. The pandemic serves as a harbinger of the types of support to future missions that Army medicine is going to be asked to carry out. So I guess the question for you is, how is the Army's medical generating force responding, and especially responding particularly through the lens of .mil-PF, to be ready to support heading into the future?
Thanks, Stephen. I'm definitely going to want some help from my partners on this one because it kind of cuts across the board with the .mil-PF. But one area that from my portfolio that I want to be able to give an example for relates to our health facilities planning agency. So it really kind of cuts across .mil-PF when you look at that. That's a generating force capability. And historically, it was focused on medical MilCon. And we still have projects ongoing. You know, we hope to get the Rhine Ordnance Barracks Medical Center completed, joint facility to replace Launchstool. We've brought online the Fort Bliss project this past year. A lot of those things, but generating force capability. How is that important in COVID? Well, we started taking a look at the DISCA missions that were out there, and the Corps of Engineers and the whole of DoD started organizing its response to COVID. In addition to the vaccine development and other things that were going, there was a need to figure out how are we going to treat this high volume of patients, both COVID and then the other patients that were also going to be out there. So our health facilities planning agency is a generating force capability that the Corps of Engineers drew on. Most of you probably heard in the news in terms of the Javits Center, right? Well, our HFPA was critical to that in terms of helping helping the Corps of Engineers figure out what was needed for a medical facility. They were also doing planning that never got implemented, thankfully, where they were looking at turning entire hotels into patient rooms and wards and things. You had to look at things like negative pressure requirements and all these medical, there's just not that expertise out there. So that's a generating force capability that we use in terms of our facilities, institutional facilities and everything, our MTFs, that really helped a lot in terms of the response to COVID, but also is out there as we adapt to what's going on in terms of LISCO and MDO. And we're looking at, emerging bases in Eastern Europe and in the Indo-Pacific, and what medical facilities are going to be needed. I know just recently, we took a look at some things in Japan for the mission set over there as well. So that that kind of allows them to, from a training perspective, and developing the doctrine and what are the capabilities needed, and then also integrating with our Reserve and National Guard. Our HFPA has been really good about this past year, reaching out and working with the training exercises from our Compo 2 and 3 as a capability that they have reached back for, because a lot of them are going to be asked to do these same kind of missions, particularly in response to DISCA, COVID, and those kind of things. So that's one example I wanted to share as it relates to our generating force capability.
Sure, and just to amplify a little bit, if you go back when we were under the real crisis of the pandemic, notably in Texas, when El Paso, Fort Hood, San Antonio, not just our MTFs, medical treatment facilities, but the local treatment facilities were under tremendous pressure with the volume of ICU patients, high acuity patients we were dealing with. And it really replicated perhaps a wartime multi-domain operation scope and scale of what we would be under, and the agility, again, that we demonstrated during that crisis, if you will, by taking other capabilities and applying it with some limited training changes to apply into the ICU and the ICW wards, and then how we were going to defer some of the other services and then recapture that over time. I think that's one takeaway that the pandemic showed us over that time.
Yeah, and I think one thing you've heard loud and clear is agility. So we had the right expertise, and we have to be agile and form to whatever's happening at the time. And so at MRDC, we did this in spades, and I'm very proud of our team. And this was in partnership with the rest of the generating force of OTSG, our Medical Center of Excellence, as well as the Defense Health Agency. And so we were able to deliver quite a few efforts. We're also working a vaccine, as I think most of you have heard, but some of the things behind the scenes that we did with our expertise, we quickly formed an additive manufacturing working group. And that, why did we do that? We had the Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard asking, hey, we got these 3D printers. Let's just print some masks and swabs and we'll just give them to everybody. And we said, well, time out. There's some FDA requirements there. Let us help you. And so we pulled that team together really quickly, got a PM to lead it, and made that happen. And then we were able to, due to supply shortages, print some of those swabs and those N95 masks and do what's needed to support supply chain issues. And that is something that we can now roll into and keep for future conflicts. As we all know, supply chain's a big issue. We have another number of other areas that we were agile with, such as telehealth and how we helped in rural areas to get critical care to those areas, providing monoclonal antibodies to hospital ships, or I'm sorry, Navy fleets, where they couldn't get these technologies. So we worked, our whole team shifted to make sure we were getting those products out to our warfighters where they were needed.
I just had one more add-on to, I quoted the old FM 1-01, but this is where, operationally useful capabilities to sustain adaptable land power capabilities was critical from the generating force. And so our force structure between the operational and generating force was critical. You heard General Harter talk about how we were able to respond in that to provide those capabilities that were needed. So our MTFs are the key to that. and they will remain the key to that support with our military, so that not only are they providing the force protection to the forces, the active duty population on the installation, but also ready to support the discommission. So this has been a great opportunity for our military within the MTS, as General Harter described. And a part of that also is our MTO assigned personnel, our MAP personnel, who are now assigned to the operational units, but work in the MTS. So they're keeping their skills up and ready, but also ready to respond at a moment's notice to whatever they're asked to do from the operational side. And then we can't forget our public health enterprise, and then what they do at the installation and MTF level in terms of responding to COVID, providing the data, the studies, and looking at also, how should the vaccines be distributed? What were the trends coming out of the CDC and all those kind of things? So a lot of capability that the Army Medical Department provides across the generating force.
Great. That much more interesting conversation I thought it would be, if I'm being honest. Also love a good Fort Hood reference. It's 8 years of my life I'll never get back. Let me stay on the telehealth topic. This is fascinating for me personally, someone coming out of the venture capital ecosystem. And I think, you don't have to go just to austere environments. You can go to West Texas, right? And that's a ideal environment for telehealth. So I think it's interesting. It has a domestic and an overseas aspect to it. So let me call out Ms. Rosarius first, and then again, feel free to tag on this. I think it's not even a cliche to say that telehealth is already plays a key role in delivering medical care to any environment where geography is an issue. So I guess for you, will telehealth serve as the backbone of such care efforts, or will it be considered just another option for medics to reference in times of crisis?
I truly believe, and our team believes, this is going to be both. It will be the backbone when it can be. We heard earlier we got to get tools down to our medics closer to the point of injury. Well, they don't have all the expertise that our surgeons or our critical care docs. So if we can radio back or communicate back some way to that higher level of expertise, to that medic to help them sustain that life longer, that is a goal of ours. But we're not always going to have that capability. And so we have to figure out other ways to help in the telehealth space. And this I could talk about for days, but it's also providing those apps or tools ahead of time so that those medics have those solutions readily available for them to walk them through how to take care of an injured warrior. There's also the capability of making sure that we're capturing that data electronically so we can pass that back to the receiving medical treatment facility, either en route of care or when they're down on the ground. So there's a lot of things we're working in this space, but bottom line is it's going to be both the backbone and just another option depending on the scenario we're in.
And certainly the pandemic accelerated, I think, the advancement of virtual health tremendously. Brooke Army Medical Center has the virtual medical center for the Army. They're actually for all of DOD. And they upped their behavioral health touch points to the point that 60% of our behavioral health touch points during this pandemic were through that virtual medical center. It's also allowing our service members who are at austere locations like Fort Polk and other places where perhaps the distance to get to some of this care and capability, virtual medical center picked up that slack, including primary care. And then on the ICU front, with Balboa Naval Medical Center, they've got the virtual ICU capability. So places like Fort Irwin, again, during this pandemic, we established virtual ICU capabilities. So we could treat anybody in these austere locations through that virtual connect. And that's not going away. All of this is now continuing to be embraced and further developed, notably with systems that can be employed on the battlefield as well.
Awesome. This is your final warning to submit questions before General Swan sucks all the air out of the room with his. Uh, let me turn to a couple of good questions that General Swan has teed up, and I'll start with one I have a lot of personal experience in. When I was in Afghanistan as a civilian, I saw a lot of issues across the board related to interoperability with our allies, and I think increasingly as we contemplate conflicts at a national strategic level, we neither have the manpower nor the force structure to do it by ourselves. We all acknowledge that, but I think especially when it comes to medical care, the issue of interoperability that General Swan poses it appears to be critical and growing. So I'll ask his question first. What are we doing to leverage allied military medical forces to ensure that interoperability in the future, whether in an austere environment or in a contested battlefield or both? Any of you who choose to tee off.
I'll start with this, just a little snippet for interoperability. PC 22, you heard about Project Convergence 21, and as we move into 22, the Army is bringing in our allied partners. And so the focus is bigger than medical, obviously, but that is one of the things we're looking at closely, is bringing those in to see if we can communicate or do telehealth or provide patient data across the network. They're bringing some tools from the UK, medical solutions from the UK, as well as I think Australia, and then we're going to test those out. So that's just one snippet of one of the things we're doing across the Army.
Question there was each country has a different medical system and how they run their medical systems within their country. And so, when that goes into the military, how do we get, I mean, that's hard enough in the combat side of military operations, but it would seem that you have cultural issues, how people deal with medical issues in different countries, and how does that, now we've had some successes in Iraq and Afghanistan with foreign military hospitals and things like that. And how, the question really is, how do we build on that? And you've kind of answered that.
Yes, sir. And there's precedents, and it started back in K4 in Kosovo. If you remember, at Pristina, we worked out the clinical protocol guidelines between us and the UK. They came into our facility, and then we reverse modeled that in Afghanistan down at Camp Bastion, where it was their role 3, but we embedded with them. But we had already set all those conditions, and our Canadian partners as well down in Kandahar. So again, maybe a little easier form and fit with our Five Eyes partners, a little more challenging when you have some language challenges, but we're continuing to work through some of that.
And sir, as I kind of mentioned earlier, in terms of our health facilities planning agency, in combat, Afghanistan and Iraq certainly had those opportunities in terms of helping them build infrastructure and everything. But they're continuing that today. And one of the projects I mentioned in terms of an alternate care facility site in Japan, in Eastern Europe, as we're interacting with Romania and Poland and looking at installations that we're going to have there. Part of the job there is also going and assessing what the infrastructure looks like in those countries, and then sharing, what our standards might be for support. So it's a really important generating force capability.
Let me ask a related question that's selfishly interesting to me. This is from another audience member. How does the medical generating force enable the Army to compete with non-military or civilian healthcare systems by building our own required talent in-house? Does that make sense?
I'll start. I think I understand what you're asking. So it is a challenge, and you heard General Dingle talk about that with talent management. For us on the medical research and development side, getting physician scientists or just PhDs is a challenge in competing with the rest of industry and academia. And so we're constantly looking at that. A lot of what General Dingle said is true. Mission means a lot. We have folks that really are in this because of the mission and not necessarily because of the pay, although sometimes we have to figure out ways to keep them on the books and help them, incentivize them. So we're always looking at different incentives to support those folks.
And I think, you know, what we do in our system, you look at our match rates and our graduate medical education programs, we exceed what the civilian force has. And in fact, we have the ability, if say you start out in a certain specialty and you finish that, but that's not really your ideal fit, you can go after another within our system. Again, the civilian sector doesn't offer as many opportunities as we do.
I think this is one of the most important aspects that we have of the generating force capability in the MTFs, and I think it's one that's often forgotten. We touched on it earlier with the G1 in terms of talent management, but our MTFs are the platforms by which we produce our surgeons, our providers, our medics, our enlisted special skills, and you just can't get that out in the civilian network. Because there just aren't enough of those specialty programs out there to be able to generate the force that we need for the Army. So this is why it's so important as we continue to move forward that we remember and understand that this is what generates those capabilities for the Army within those MTFs.
Is there, as kind of a follow-up question that Dan Roper asked, are there any adjustments needed when you look at the blend between medical professionals from the active guard and reserve components between the operational and generating forces? Any recommendations or advice you give?
Well, I'll describe, you know, within the National Guard, you have actual surgeons in a general medical officer billet. And so we're looking at opportunities for them to crosswalk into either the Compo 3 or the active component and actually serve as a surgeon in that component. And we'll backfill into the National Guard some capability, but there's tremendous agility and capability within the Compo 2 and 3 that they bring to the fight that can't be replicated. I don't think anywhere else in the world. Over.
So as we wrap up, I think we're almost at time. I'd like to go back and maybe in reverse order, starting with Ms. Rosarius. Any final closing comments, thoughts, or frankly, topics or questions we didn't ask as kind of fodder for the audience to go away with?
Sure. First, thank you. Thank you for having us here today. As part of the generating force, what we bring to the table from medical research, development, and acquisition is essential, especially in the modernization of the Army. And so we always have to remember, and we've heard this a lot today, that we cannot forget Army medicine or DoD medicine when we're modernizing the force. It is always an afterthought. And usually it's because of that agility we talked about, we're able to make it work. But it would be much better if we could have the financial support up front to make sure that we have the solutions we need early, so then we can work through all that .mil PF areas that we talked about with training and education and ensuring that our troops have what they need and they know how to function and use those when they're deployed. Thanks.
No, as the TSG said, it's the total AMEDD. In the generating force, operating force are inextricably linked to provide what readiness the Army needs. And as the TSG also described, our MTFs, our live fire action is going on every day. They're working their live fire exercise. Over.
So just to kind of recap what I started with as a reminder, we have 5 primary organizations that make up the Medical Generating Force: the Army Medical Logistics Command, the Medical Research and Development Command, the Medical Center of Excellence, the MedCom, and the OTSG. And as Lieutenant General Dingle talked about in his earlier comments, he was told by the chief, get in step, stay in step. And the way he does that is through the Army Medicine Campaign Plan. The primary objective within that campaign plan is to synchronize and integrate the medical effort. And so that's what's critical in order to build readiness and support modernization, which are 2 of those other objectives within that campaign plan. to ensure that the generating force supports that operating force and that we accomplish the Army's mission. Thanks.
So as it's undoubtedly been highlighted before, today is the 80th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And if any of you studied not just the battle, but the U.S. military leading up to that, readiness and modernization were not a big deal right up until the point that they were everything. And then we were scrambling for the next year, really, before we were able to flow forces into theater in every aspect in a meaningful way. So ideally, we prepare and we discuss these topics today so we don't have to chase our tail in the future. I'd like to thank AUSA for putting this on, General Brown, General Swan, and the whole team. This has been a great event for me personally. And I think one final important comment, go Army.
Folks, we're going to take about a 45-minute break. We've got some light lunch refreshments out here for you. Check the front desk for your membership status. And one more thank you to our sponsor today, Leidos. Please be back at 12:45. Thank you. It's always great to see the hardcore folks staying after lunch. We get a little bit of attrition during lunch, but we're glad you're all here for our afternoon session. We've got two great panels to wrap up the rest of the day, but I think we've gotten a lot accomplished. I'm very proud here to introduce the next panel, Trauma Initiatives, Recruiting, Retention, and Skills, kind of a broad-ranging panel that'll be led by my good friend, Major General Joe Caravallo, President and CEO of the Henry M. Jackson Foundation for the Advancement of Military Medicine, and my former neighbor at Fort Sam Houston, right down the street there at Staff Post. But one thing I got from that tour of duty at Fort Sam as the Army North Commander was opportunity to visit Brooke Army Medical Center many times. And just hearkening back to the last panel, the whole discussion about health and fitness for our soldiers, I got to see it firsthand. Many of you have too, how quickly people recover from injury based on how well they go into an injury. And you could see that with amputees and others, how quickly an amputee can recover, as quickly as they can, but it's much faster when they are well cared for and well prepared, not unlike a professional athlete coming back from an injury to be ready for the next season. So a lot of learning here, and that tour of duty was an eye-opener for me. But we're going to talk about a wide range of things, and then we're going to wrap up this afternoon with a very important discussion on behavioral health, resiliency, and how important that is to